West Texas is one place you don't want to be when you feel like you could be losing your mind. It's almost too quiet, except for the dry wind rubbing against your skin, or the buzzard circling above, just waiting for you to drop. It's as if you stepped through a doorway into the forgotten. Seeing a familiar face in this part of the world was unheard of, and if you did, they may not be real. At night, the highway resembled some sort of scar etched into the dead land. Mesquite crouched low against the dirt, and wind turbines turned slow in the distance while their blinking red lights watched overhead. The further you drove from town, the less the world felt real. Gas stations became islands of fluorescent light floating in the dark, and the long stretches in between had a way of making a man think way too much. Eddie drove these roads 6 nights a week. Driving a tow truck was not something he had planned, but it was a job, and in Red Bluff, that was enough. He had once thought he would leave West Texas behind for good. Now, he spent most nights crawling across it at 70 miles an hour, with cold coffee in the cup holder and an old CB radio hissing softly to itself. Nobody really used them anymore, except truckers maybe too old to let the habit die, and ranch hands stranded somewhere without cell service. The windshield was smeared with bug guts and dust. Every few seconds, the wipers swept across the glass while country music muttered low through the speakers. Eddie was 38 years old and divorced, with the worn look of a man who had spent too many years hauling wrecks out of ditches in the middle of the night. It sat on him heavy, the kind of tired that you couldn't sleep off. He passed the empty truck stop outside County Line Road and glanced toward the diner windows glowing against the dark. He could see the same waitress inside going through the same routine, while moths crowded against the glass, fighting for the light like they did every night. Eddie barely noticed the miles passing beneath him. Out here, out in the open, the world seemed too big. But right now, in this moment, something pressed down on him like there wasn't enough room to draw breath. The CB crackled suddenly. He reached down automatically, expecting another trucker asking about highway patrol. Static continued to roll to the speaker. Then, "Hello?" It was a voice buried under interference, a young man's voice. Eddie adjusted the volume. "You copy?" the voice continued. The transmission warped hard enough to make the speaker pop. Then it came again. "Eddie?" Eddie's hand slipped on the wheel, and the truck drifted slightly over the shoulder rumble strips before he corrected it. Static filled the speaker for a second, then, "Don't stop listening," the voice said. Eddie stopped breathing. It sounded just like Caleb. The same drawl, the same roughness in the throat. He snatched the CB mic. "Caleb!" Nothing, only static. He pressed the button harder. "Caleb, where are you?" The next transmission burst loud enough to make him flinch. But it wasn't Caleb this time. It was a scream, a woman, crying somewhere far away beneath layers of distortion. Then, silence. Eddie pulled over and sat behind the wheel while the tow truck idled beneath the stars. His heartbeat thudded so hard he could feel it behind his eyes. 3 years. 3 goddamn years. "Where the hell are you, Caleb?" he said out loud. People in Red Bluff said Caleb left town after another meth binge. Others had said it was an overdose. A few claimed they'd seen him in Amarillo or Oklahoma City, but the stories always changed depending on who was drinking. Eddie never believed any of them, not really, because Caleb had reached out to him that night, the last night. He could still remember staring at his phone while it rang on the kitchen counter with his brother's name glowing back at him. He had let it go to voicemail, but out of anger. Didn't really care at the time. He figured Caleb just needed money again. Didn't he always? He always needed something, or saving. He never called just to say hello, just to visit like families should. Eddie felt like he was drowning along with him. In less than 2 hours, Caleb vanished. His body was never found, nor his truck. Nothing. The sheriff's department had searched for weeks before finally giving up. It seemed like everyone did, except for Eddie. He grabbed the CB mic again with both hands. "Caleb?" Nothing. Just the desert wind pushing against the truck. The next night, Eddie repeated his run. He drove the same stretch of road for 6 hours straight. This time, there were no transmissions on the CB, no voices, just static and nearby truckers complaining about the price of diesel. It was just after midnight when he nearly convinced himself exhaustion had finally cracked something loose in his head. But that's when the radio whispered again. A different voice, a young female, barely audible. Mile marker 82. The sound made Eddie's skin tighten. Then she came back. Please. Static washed over the transmission. Then, Dad, is that you? The static returned and hung there. Eddie stared at the speaker. A few seconds later, another voice pushed through, making Eddie jump. This time it was a male in panic. You need to send somebody! Then it cut off. Silence again. Eddie grabbed the mic. Who is this? Nothing. He checked the signal meter. It jumped wildly on its own, and the speaker hissed. Then Caleb was back. You need to stop answering, Caleb said. Eddie's stomach dropped. Where are you? Heavy static crackled around Caleb's voice, cutting in and out. It sounded all wrong, distant and metallic, like somebody trying to talk underwater. Caleb! There was a long pause. Then something strange happened. Eddie heard a faint voice in the background. He didn't hear it outside the truck, but through the radio itself, buried somewhere beneath the static. He couldn't make out a single word, only the shape of a voice. Caleb seemed to turn away from him, as if speaking to someone else. No, he said quietly. The faint voice responded. What do you mean no? Eddie snapped into the mic. Caleb didn't answer him. The muffled voice came again, still impossible to understand. For a second it sounded almost like someone speaking through a hand covering their mouth. Then Caleb whispered, I told you, he already answered. The transmission dissolved into a burst of static. Caleb! Nothing. Several seconds passed before his brother finally returned. When he spoke again, he sounded farther away. Under it, he said. The transmission stopped. Eddie sat frozen in the dark. In the distance, he saw heat lightning flicker behind storm clouds. Eddie didn't sleep much after that. During the day, he searched online records, newspaper archives, and old forums about missing persons, highway deaths, and disappearances. He guessed that the young girl's voice he had heard might have belonged to a 14-year-old girl named Erica Dunn who had vanished in 1998 outside of Clarendon, Texas, while walking home from a football game. There was also a state trooper who had been killed on Highway 287 in 2006, just after calling in a disabled vehicle. He wondered if that was the voice of the other male. He was sure every voice he had heard on the radio belonged to somebody dead or missing. By the fourth night in a row, the transmissions were happening constantly. Now he was convinced who they all were. It was always after midnight and always stronger outside of Red Bluff. Sometimes the voices begged for help and even screamed. But then there were the ones that sounded so calm it made his blood run cold. One elderly man spent nearly 2 minutes calling out names before breaking into sobs. Another voice whispered numbers backward until the transmission collapsed into static. Eddie felt sick to his stomach when he started paying attention to the sound behind the voices. Breathing, movement, something wet, and something scraping. He began recording everything on an old cassette deck he had found in his trailer. He was barely eating and hadn't showered in a couple of days. His ex-wife stopped by one afternoon to check on him after he had missed 2 payments. She took one look at the tape scattered across the kitchen table and asked if he had started drinking again. He told her to leave. Now his evenings looked different. He would leave for work just to end up parking outside of town far enough to not draw too much attention. He sat. He waited. That night he heard Caleb crying. It wasn't loud, not dramatic. Just the quiet whimper, childlike, quietly crying underneath a blanket of radio snow. It was real enough to rip Eddie on the inside. "Eddie?" Eddie grabbed the mic instantly. "I'm here." "You shouldn't have answered." "Tell me where you are," Eddie said. Static churned hard through the speaker. Then Caleb said something that made Eddie feel cold all the way to his stomach. "It knows when people listen." The transmission cut off. A second later, every channel on the CB exploded at once. Voices overlapped. There must have been hundreds of them, crying, whispering, pleading. Eddie jerked backward so hard he knocked his coffee across the dash. One woman's voice rose above the others. She sounded terrified. "It learns your voice," she said. Then silence slammed down so suddenly that the absence of sound felt wrong. Eddie shut the CB off. Outside, the open plain sat completely still. No wind, no insects, nothing. Like the world itself was listening. The coordinates started 2 nights later. Caleb repeated them 3 times across separate transmissions. He gave latitude and longitude and always ended the same way. "Don't come alone." Eddie wrote them down, and by dusk he was driving west into dead government land most people avoided. The desert had flattened into hard-packed dirt and old fencing eaten apart by rust. More storm clouds had gathered low. He had driven nearly an hour before spotting the structure. At first it looked like a hill. Then he saw the metal protruding from the earth, along with what looked like blast doors. He saw massive antennas that were collapsed and half buried. The fence surrounding the place sagged inward where sections had rotted away, and a weathered sign still clung to one post reading, "United States Government, Restricted Area, No Trespassing." Most of the lettering had faded away. Eddie parked beside the ruins, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped out into hot wind carrying the smell of rain. It was too quiet for him. The main structure sat mostly underground beneath layers of concrete and sand. He found various footprints in the dirt leading to what appeared to be the main entrance. He couldn't decide if maybe some teenagers had been there recently. Or something more elusive. No, that's stupid, he told himself. It can't be. But he went through the doors anyway. The flashlight beam shook slightly in his hand. Once inside, the station descended deeper than he expected. It was made up of concrete hallways with rust-stained walls, and in some places old wiring hung down from the ceiling like vines. Most of the equipment had been stripped decades ago, but enough remained to tell him what the place used to be. It appeared to be a listening station, maybe set up sometime after World War II. There were rows of communications equipment lining the main chamber beneath inches of dust. Eddie stepped deeper into the room, then froze. He noticed radios were powered on, not all of them. Just one. A faint orange glow flickered from beneath cracked glass, and static whispered softly through a speaker. He approached slowly. The speaker crackled as he inched closer. Caleb spoke. "Eddie?" Eddie jumped. "Where are you?" The answer came instantly. "Below you." The floor vibrated with a movement deep underneath the concrete. Eddie stepped backward. The radios around the room suddenly clicked alive together, one after another. Static erupted from every speaker, and voices flooded the chamber, hundreds of them, and maybe more. They were mixed with crying, screaming, and whispering like prayers. He could hear the different ages and personalities in their voices. A child begged for his mother. Another man calmly recited license plate numbers, and another person asked for forgiveness. The sound was unbearable. Eddie covered his ears, but the voices kept pouring through the room like water. One speaker near the far wall screeched with feedback. Then a calm male voice said, "It copies what it hears." Another answered immediately, "Don't let it learn you." Then Caleb's voice came through above everything else, calm and steady. "Eddie, it knows you answered." All the lights overhead flickered on, and dust rained from the ceiling. Somewhere deep below the station, something massive shifted. It wasn't movement from a person, but more pressure. Eddie backed toward the hallway while the radios continued to scream. He needed to get out and started to move toward the exit. Then another voice stopped him cold. His own. Panicked and breathless. "If you hear my voice, don't answer." He listened, unsure if what he had heard was what he thought it was. Was that really his own voice? Then it continued. "It can follow voices now." Then the floor lurched violently, and metal screamed somewhere below. Eddie ran. The hallway lights started snapping on and off while alarms suddenly wailed through the station. Behind him, the voices rose together into one horrible sound that was no longer human, like too many people trying to speak through the same throat. Eddie reached the blast doors and stumbled outside into the violent wind. The rain had started falling and the buried station grown deep underground. Then he heard it. Not from the radios, but somewhere beneath the earth, a voice of something ancient trying to say his name. He jumped into his truck and floored it across the dirt road while thunder cracked overhead. The CB radio remained completely silent the entire drive home, and that scared him the most. Before dawn lingered over Red Bluff, faint gray light touched the empty highways while the town slept. Eddie sat beside his trailer wearing yesterday's clothes next to a rusted burn barrel with the CB radio inside. He stared at it a long time before lighting the match, and for a second his hand shook too hard to strike it. But the flame caught, the fire spread slowly across the radio casing. The plastic blackened and curled inward. Smoke rose into the morning sky. The smell of melting wires carried away in the wind. He waited for something to happen, maybe hear a voice. But there was nothing. No voices, not even static. It was just the fire crackling softly in the barrel. Then relief hit him all at once. Real relief. After weeks of terror, maybe it was over. Maybe whatever lived beneath the station couldn't survive daylight. He wasn't sure anymore, but he didn't care. He just wanted peace. Maybe Caleb was gone long before the first transmission ever reached him. The fire popped loudly, and Eddie looked down. Inside the barrel, the CB continued to melt. That's when it finally crackled. Static came to life. One final transmission pushed through the flames. "Eddie?" He sat there in horror because this time it wasn't Caleb's voice. It was his own, cold and impatient. "Eddie, answer me!" The CB shrieked with static. Then something answered back from inside the fire. Whatever it was didn't answer back with words, but a breath, slow and deep, immense. Eddie didn't move. Then the breathing stopped. For a moment there was nothing, but then the speaker crackled once more. Something inhaled, like it was listening, waiting for him to answer.